It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Wednesday. It's a midweek edition of the show. Hey, thanks so much for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a part of your workday. And a big shout out to everybody also listening out there on the RealAg Radio podcast. It is great to be back. It feels like it has been way too long. And I was only away for Friday's show, wasn't here for Monday, and Lindsay covered on yesterday. So great, and by the way, great job by Lindsay, guest hosting the show. Fantastic work. But it feels like, wow, I missed everybody. I missed being able to have conversations like this, and yeah, it's great to be back. I'm glad to be back in the host chair. Today on the program, we're going to hear from Ryder Lee from the Canadian Cattle Association to talk about some of the comments that the Canadian Cattle Association has towards potential changes to the Product of USA label in the United States, of course. And listen, meat trade, beef trade between Canada and the U.S. is critical for both countries, and CCA has some concerns. And some of these concerns are, I remember going back to the cattle convention, the NCBA meeting back in early February, and talking to Dennis Laycraft about this. So Lindsay had a chance to talk to Ryder Lee from CCA about some of CCA's thoughts. We're also going to hear today from Justin Funk of Agriculture. We've got the latest edition, the May results for the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. So we'll hear how you, the audience, is feeling about the current environment that you're having to function in the agricultural industry. And we'll also hear today from John Barlow. He's the Shadow Minister for Agriculture for the Conservative Party of Canada. We're like at a snail's pace, and that may be complimentary. At least it feels that way. Bill C-234. Now, this is the bill that's going to exempt you from having to pay a carbon tax on something like grain drying. Okay, it is moving through the system slow. We've been waiting on the Senate. Now, so there was some action last night. Okay, so we do have a bit of an update on that. John's going to provide his perspective on how, honestly, C-234, it's really up against the clock when it comes to trying to get this sucker under royal assent before the summer break. And if it moves into the fall, there are some risk factors, and John's going to talk about that. I will also ask him about Bungie and Viterra and whether the Ag Committee will have some comments on that as well. And we'll also have time for the top ag news stories of the day. Listen, if you have any feedback, comments, thoughts, questions, something to hammer at me about, I want to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms as Real Agriculture, or you can call that RealAg feedback line. Yes, sir, indeed. It is 855-776-6147. Now, some of you have sent me some emails regarding this new program we have coming out. It is sponsored by Princess Auto. It's called RealAg Shops, and we're going to be profiling shops across the country. If you have a new shop you've built that you're super proud of, if you've retrofitted an old shop, maybe you saved an old aircraft hangar, maybe you turned an old barn into a shop, or you grain storage shed now is any cool features and looks to your shop, reach out to us, and we'd love to feature your shop in our new series. Absolutely. It's going to be really fun. RealAg Shops, brought to you by Princess Auto. And it's going to be a lot of, almost like, it's like the MTV Cribs kind of style of programming. It's going to be a lot of fun. I shot the pilot already, and we had a great time. So that series is launching in July. So if you have a shop that you think is worthwhile, send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to jump into a conversation with John Barlow, Shadow Minister for Agriculture for the Conservative Party of Canada, right after this. It's now time for a product spotlight with U.S. Borax. We're talking to Roger Gunning. So when we're talking about refined borate fertilizers, why does it matter where the borates come from?
It actually comes from Boron, California, which is a small town. It's one of the richest borate deposits on the planet. It's about the purity of the product, but for a few reasons, I think our North America farmers, we're closer. The convenience of our distributors and warehouse locations with no import restrictions. And this helps allow us to provide a better service than other borate fertilizer suppliers. Our customers, they can be confident that we're providing them with a refined borate product free from impurities that may pose a problem, for their crops.
Well, as we've been saying here on RealAg Radio for the past couple months, Granubor from US Borax. Ask for it by name and go to borax.com.
How's your seed quality? What should you treat with? What about herbicide carryover and environmental concerns? Spring is here, and you've got a lot of things to think about in regards to your pulse crop. The Pulse School on Real Agriculture has information and advice for all these questions and more to help you navigate this season. Brought to you by BASF. Pulse School episodes are available at pulseschool.com, realagriculture.com, or as a podcast on your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Remember Bill C-234? This is the piece of legislation that's essentially trying to exempt the carbon tax on things like grain drying, among other activities that happen on the farm, that need to happen, that there's no real sort of green solution. There's a solar paneled grain dryers, for example, meaning that farms don't really have any other options and have to just pay the carbon tax. So Bill C-234, it's been at the Senate since early May. It's had some struggles. Now, it had some movement last night, and earlier today I had a chance to catch up with the Shadow Minister of Agriculture for the Conservative Party of Canada, Mr. John Barlow, to talk about the importance of this bill and why maybe it took so long to get through the Senate.
The Senate is a bit different, where it can't move on to the next stage until the critic senator speaks to it. And Senator Dalfond of Quebec is the critic of C-234 in the Senate. And thus far, he's been refusing to speak on it, so basically holding it up. We're trying to get it onto the committee stage with hopes of getting it back to the House for third reading and royal assent by the end of this session. So we're really crunched on time. He's been doing a good job of ragging the puck. But on the good news, through intense pressure from stakeholders and ourselves, he did speak on it late last night. So we're hoping it'll get to committee tomorrow.
Was his ragging the puck, as you put it? Everybody will get that reference. Was that a retaliation to some of the things that Leader Poilievre did with the budget in the House in terms of his filibuster, or unrelated?
Unrelated, as far as I can tell. Making some phone calls to some of the senators that we were asking to put some pressure on. Senator Wells from the Conservatives, Senator Black, who's an independent, who's a strong proponent of this legislation. It seems that this was the Liberal government asking that senator to hold this up as long as possible. And there may be some horse trading in the Senate as well on other bills, but the budget was certainly not one that was discussed. But all in all, our argument on this is that this is a critical piece of legislation for farmers and Canadians who are facing much higher costs, inflationary impact on inputs, and certainly on the price of food. And this isn't about we can have the argument on anti-carbon tax, pro-carbon tax, anti-carbon tax another day. This is really what we're trying to push on this. This is just fixing an oversight on the original Price on Pollution Act, where they did not include natural gas and propane on the list of exemptions. So that's really what we're trying to reiterate to the senators. So
now it goes to committee. It's going to the Ag Committee in the Senate, but it's also the Finance Committee, if I'm correct. Is that true?
From what I understand now, it's going to go to Agriculture and Environment.
Okay.
So different set of circumstances in the Senate where it could potentially go through two committees. We don't have that in the House. Usually it would just go to one or the other. And that's fine. Hopefully, the Agriculture Committee, from what I understand, sort of has precedence as the lead committee on this issue. It's fine to have that discussion. We just really wanted to get it through this backlog, and hopefully they can quickly deal with this at the committee stage. And like I said, give farmers a break on some pretty high costs.
Does it have enough time to get assent here before Parliament breaks for the summer?
It's going to be really tight, Shaun. I'm not going to sugarcoat this. We needed him to speak on this last night. That was our last very small window, and get this to the committees tomorrow. And if they can get it through the committee stage in one meeting each, there's certainly some potential for us to get royal assent on this next week before we rise next Thursday or Friday. Certainly, fingers are crossed. We know how important this is and how much support we've had for this bill. And again, we've had the support of all the opposition parties on this. The Bloc, the NDP, even the Greens joined the Conservatives in supporting this. We had a handful of Liberals even vote in favor of this. So we know how important this is. And, it's not often you get all the opposition parties pulling in the same direction on something like this. So we understand the support that's out there for this and how important this is to our farmers.
So what happens if it's punted to the fall? Risk that there's an election called and this doesn't actually make it onto the books?
Yeah, that is our concern. Or they prorogue during the summer and then goes into the fall. That just delays things even further. Or potentially, you're right, a fall election. We win that election, we scrap the carbon tax altogether, and this is a moot point. But to get this so close to the finish line in two back-to-back parliaments and to be sidetracked both times due to an election call would be frustrating, certainly for the stakeholders and those who have worked so hard to get this to the point where we are now.
John, we've been hearing that the current political environment on the Hill there in Ottawa is quite partisan. Is that your experience comparing relatively to, you've been around there for a while. What's your thoughts on those statements?
I think it's a little overblown. Certainly there's a stark contrast between what Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are offering Canadians compared to what Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberals are offering Canadians right now. But I think, Shaun, and you've seen it firsthand, the work that we do at the committee level, there certainly isn't that partisanship that you may see in question period or in the media. And obviously that depends a lot on the personalities involved as well. But I think many of us understand that for the most part, we're here to do our best for Canadians, do our best for our constituents. And to do those things, you have to work across party lines. You have to try and find those colleagues that have, similar viewpoints or can work on common ground. And I am really proud of the work we do at the Agriculture Committee. Certainly we have some disagreements, but I think we do try to work pretty hard to try and find a compromise and get things moving along, which again makes 234 so frustrating as I know that my Liberal colleagues did not all support this, but we had a few that did. And when you work hard to find those compromises and then for it to get stuck up in the Senate is frustrating.
The House Ag Committee completed its, I guess, look into food prices and whether or not, the grocery industry was doing things that were, harming Canadians or taking advantage of the inflation situation. What can you tell us about the findings?
Yeah, I actually found it quite revealing. And I was actually in Manitoba this week, meeting with some producers, Keystone Agriculture producers in Manitoba pork. But I ran into a carrot farmer, and he was one of only a few left in the Portage La Prairie area. And he was explaining to me that he's just been nickeled and dimed to death by the large grocery chains on fees and fines and those types of things. Something I didn't really know a whole heck of a lot about until we did this study. And it became quite clear that there are some things that we need to address. And it showed the importance of the Grocery Code of Conduct, that there are some transparency and accountability to the big grocery chains when they try to implement these fees and fines on producers. Certainly there has to be more transparency, more clout for the Competition Bureau to be able to dig into the numbers. Certainly we had the economists that were there as well as the grocery chains were quite adamant that, their profit margin on food is about 4%. But they won't break that down in terms of where their profits are coming from pharmacy or clothing or other goods that they're selling at the grocery stores. And I think that has to be much clearer to Canadians, and certainly the Competition Bureau, for it to do its job, it must have all that data. I think as a Conservatives, we will be doing a dissenting report on this, and it's not something we do very often. But the Liberals and the NDP refuse to include the impacts of the carbon tax is having on food inflation and food costs. And I think if you're going to have a discussion on, an honest discussion on the rising cost of food, and we've seen that the Canada Food Price Index is forecasting a 34% increase in food over the next 2 years. Those are staggering numbers. So if you really want to be honest about what those costs are and where they're coming from, we have to discuss all of the issues. And for them to vote down a recommendation to study the impact the carbon tax has on food prices and the supply chain, I think was disingenuous, and certainly a decision made on ideology, not on data. So I think we could have dug a little deeper, but some interesting revelations came out of it for sure.
Yeah. The Retail Council of Canada was out with some statements here this morning, and they said the findings were markedly different from the surrounding rhetoric at the outset of the hearings. Clearly, they're seeing a win here for their stakeholders.
Yeah, one of the recommendations put forward was a windfall tax on the large grocery chains, and that just didn't prove from the data that we were able to see that was necessary or factual. So that recommendation was not approved. Again, I think that is a pretty fair statement that we weren't able to see any gotcha moment or unveil some hidden mass profits that these grocery chains were making. But there is lack of competition there. There is a lack of transparency in terms of where they are making their profits. And my assumption, or what I would get from this, is they're making most of their profits from pharmaceuticals, and they don't want to reveal that too openly. But I think we should be able to get more of this information or more protections, let's say, Shaun, for on the ground producers when it comes to some of these fees and fines that are being charged to them by the Loblaws and the Metros and the empires out there.
Yeah, and finally, John, you mentioned the Competition Bureau of Canada. They're going to be definitely, I would assume, taking a look at the proposed takeover of Viterra by Bunge. There's concern about a loss of jobs around the Regina area for sure, where Viterra was their headquarters. As a member of the House Ag Committee, and as well, obviously, the Shadow Minister of Agriculture, any thoughts on this potential deal?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look over it in detail other than what I've read this morning on RealAg Radio's newsletter. Thank you very much for sending that out. But we will be asking the Competition Bureau to look at this. Anytime we see a lack of or a reduction in competition in any sector, but certainly the agriculture sector is concerning. We don't want to see that that lack of competition, but certainly the impact it could have on jobs in our rural communities, and I would include that with Viterra and Bunge. So we will be taking a look at this for sure.
John, thanks a lot for joining us here today. Really appreciate it. All the best to you, and hopefully you get a chance to get out of Ottawa sooner than later.
Looking forward to it. Thanks very much, Shaun. I appreciate your interest and everyone's support on contacting and emailing and calling the senators on 234 and putting some pressure on them to get this moving again.
That was John Barlow, Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food with the Conservative Party of Canada. We need 234. We need this to exempt farmers from some of these carbon tax costs where there is no other option. So important work. Let's hope that it can get done before the summer session. But as John said there, not to sugarcoat it, it's looking really super tough here at this point. Super tough. And once she rolls into fall, then it's you just don't know. There's a big risk here. So this may not be top of mind for farmers right now, but by fall time, this will be a big issue. Farm Group's been working hard behind the scenes, trying to push as hard as possible to make this happen in time before the summer break. Interesting thoughts also from John when it comes to Bunge and Viterra. This is something that I think is it's going to get the attention, and the Competition Bureau is going to have a lot to say here. And I can kind of see both sides of the equation. Some people believe the Competition Bureau needs to stop it. I've had others argue that there's not as much overlap as some want to make it sound like. Obviously, time will tell. And like always, if you have any feedback on what you think about all this, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. When we come back on RealAg Radio, we are going to talk about Productive USA in the U.S. and what that potentially means when it comes to labeling for Canadian beef headed south. You're listening to RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147.
Did you know that Pioneer now has a full lineup of Enlist E3 soybeans? Take a look at Pioneer brand Enlist E3 soybeans for the highest yield potential and for the best agronomic package and herbicide trait options. From the lab to the field, Pioneer brand Enlist E3 soybeans are the best in beans, period. Ask your local Pioneer representative about Enlist E3 beans.
As you head out into the field this season, the Corn School's got you covered. Everything from tillage discussions, weed control info, field trial results, yield strategies, and more. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast from your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Shaun Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today. I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture, and joining me now on the line is Ryder Lee. He's the General Manager for the Canadian Cattle Association. And Ryder, yesterday I got a peek at the letter that the Canadian government has sent to the U.S. regarding their Product of USA label, a voluntary label, and its impact or potential impact on our beef and other protein industries in between Canada and the U.S. Ryder, why is this voluntary label possibly so problematic?
Well, like you said, it is a proposed or possibly, and so having an input here into what it might actually become is really important, and that process happens all the time on both sides. But generally, we're commenting on things that are happening in Ottawa, proposed rules and regulations. But we've got a real integrated market in North America where the cattle and sometimes the feed move across borders, both north and south from the United States, into Canada and Mexico. At times they need to, and that really allows the industry to, do the right things and the best things that the market is calling for. And putting something like this in place that, clogs up that system and just costs without benefits is not good for cattle producers or the whole beef industry on either side.
So, so to back up a little bit here for those who maybe this has fallen off their radar, or they haven't followed along, this proposal would essentially mean that in order to carry the label of Product of USA, it would require that an animal be born, raised and fed, and processed in the U.S. So, as you just related, like we have cattle that move to be fed in Canada, or they come from Canada to be fed in the U.S., or we have animals that move, either side of the border to be processed. So as soon as any of that movement would happen at any time in that lifespan, they immediately would no longer qualify for that label. Is that correct?
That's my understanding of the proposal. And just, listen to yourself describing that. How is that going to be workable and useful, and how does that tell a story to a consumer when we do have product lines out there that are already there, that you can tell the story of whatever that product's life has been, it's already set up and you can be doing that. So getting government involved in making things have to be certain ways just sucks money out of the industry. You know, they call it a deadweight loss and economists speak, and that's what we'd like to avoid.
That's right, because this will, of course, if goes forward as proposed, would require segregation of animals or meat. In the letter that the Government of Canada has sent to the U.S., they call this, as proposed, discriminatory against Canadian cattle, and really, lays out that this would potentially be detrimental, as opposed to positive, be detrimental even for American ranchers or the American system as well. Because, as you stated, for some, the proximity to Canada means that they can make a better business decision by selling cattle, let's say, north, or buying feed, or those sorts of things. So how does, as a cattle industry, how do you argue, the opposite of what this proposal intends to do? Do you think that you have a convincing argument that, lawmakers will hear on this one?
Well, I think so, and you do your best. You work with everybody that you can. We've worked with the Meat Council, the packers, we worked with the cattle feeders, we've worked with U.S. and Mexican industry and legal advisors, and you put it all in there. Some of it is, have they followed the legal rules of their own lawmaking and regulation making? Have they thought through the market implications and how the industry really works, and what would the costs be that go along with this, and is that what you're looking to do? So you throw everything in there that you can to make sure that those that are in charge and the way that it's done is being done legally, and it's a tough one, because you have to do all that you can, but now we're in that waiting, going, well, has this had the effect that we're looking for? And we'll know down the road. We've been down this road before with mandatory country of origin labeling, and this is kind of a rinse and redo of that with a little bit different paint job, and we'll see what comes and what our next steps will be when that happens.
Right, and of course, the mandatory country of origin labeling was found not to be trade compliant. Canada eventually, and I use the term eventually, did reign victorious on that one, was allowed to levy some pretty significant penalties on that one, but it was an incredibly lengthy process to go through. My question is, in this proposal, and as you've mentioned before, there are verified beef or certification programs out there that, may do something similar to this, but they're voluntary, they're not government-based. There are accreditation systems, essentially, for different meat streams. Those already exist. My question is, in something that would be, yes, voluntary, but law and for the entire country, given how integrated the Canadian and U.S. cattle industry is, can the U.S. actually meet its beef demand in the immediacy should something like this roll out?
Well, that's a large question.
Right? Because, in my mind, no one would be able to actually use the label for quite some time, because you'd have to completely start segregating and all that stuff.
And that's some of the conversations and some of the things that we've heard, that would be, as it says, it's voluntary, and nobody would be stepping up and using it right off the bat. But does it become something that changes procurement, changes practices, and rolls up into something down the road that does effectively discriminate against Canadian cattle? Well, then we'd be stepping forward and battling against that as we have in the past, because that just widens the basis, and that means lower prices to Canadian producers.
One of the things that I found interesting that the Canadian government outlines in its letter to the U.S. is, often we think of, whole cuts of beef or those sorts of things, but that, this would apply to even trim and any ingredient that's added during the processing stage, if it's not U.S. based, it could no longer carry that label. And that's just, to me, is an inefficient nightmare, in that even byproducts would be, or, you know, they would be part of this system. That's just a headache. I can't even imagine it.
A headache and a value suck as well.
Yeah.
Like there's something that you get in these conversations about why are we importing anything into the U.S.? We export more than that. Well, a good chunk of what you import into the U.S. and some into Canada as well is grinding meat that you mix with the extra fat off of fed cattle to make burgers and other grinds. And it adds value to the way we finish our cattle. Otherwise, that would all go into rendering and would be worth rendering price, not ground beef at a store price. So not only would it be complicated, but it would be value destroying.
Is this so? And we've certainly seen, you know, this is on the surface one of those feel good sort of like buy American, you know, keep it local, all those sorts of like that's the, if someone looked at it on the surface, you think, yeah, okay, great. But again, once you dig into it, it really, and for anyone who's curious, I mean, we're talking obviously about the beef industry because it is a huge player in this and will be impacted greatly should something like this go forward. But we are talking about hogs as well, even poultry. You know, Canada and the U.S. have a fully integrated system on so many fronts that when you dig below the surface of this, it really becomes incredibly disruptive to an industry that, you know, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I don't see any glaring problems at this point in time that this is really fixing. Like, it feels like it's a rule that's making a problem, not fixing a problem.
Yeah, and the thing is, like so much of our lives, it's built up on a lot of little decisions over a long time that made things better at the time and made it, well, this will work better than we've been doing it up to now. And then when you come into a system like that that's built on so many of those decisions and you say, oh, cripes, we're just going to make this big change, that piece of work tends to wipe out a lot of decisions that were right and have built up over time into efficiencies. And it does more than just, oh, we'll just tweak this little thing. No, you're not tweaking one little thing. You're trying to replace a lot of well thought out decisions and the evolution that fell out from them. So it becomes a big spanner in the works instead of just a little tweak.
So going forward, so this letter, of course, has been put forward. What is the timeline from CCA's perspective? Is there a date on the calendar sort of circled of when a final decision would be and the busyness you'll have until then? What's next in the timeline? There
generally isn't when it's at this step. There's a deadline to get your comments in, and then they take their own sweet time with dealing with that input and deciding what to do next. Sometimes it'll go to the next step. Sometimes it'll have to start over. Sometimes it will just be on hold and you don't know what's going to unfold. So we've done what we can for now, and we'll stay tuned until we learn what is coming next. We'll keep an eye on that and all the other things that develop or might come forward. There's a cast of usual suspects in U.S. Congress that have some protectionist bents and continue to put forward ideas like this that we have to watch out for and step up on behalf of producers when they do step forward.
It certainly does seem to be a bit of a busier time on the agriculture front than perhaps it has been in the last while. So, yes. So, Ryder, I do appreciate the time today, keeping us up to date. We'll be watching closely and seeing where this goes. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That was Real Agriculture's Lindsay Smith talking to Ryder Lee from the Canadian Cattle Association. You know, the biggest thing is with these Product of USA label changes, the intention was to fix a situation with South American beef coming into the U.S. in a box, being repackaged and then labeled Product of USA. The intent was not to somehow turn this into country of origin labeling. and punishing countries like Canada that are a critical component to the U.S. beef system. That goes both ways. And so we got scope creep potentially, and that is where the concern lies. Let me tell you about the Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association. They're inviting you to attend partnerships. It's the farmer and the cattleman to hear from guest speakers Rick Clark and Terry Aberhart, as well as a panel of farmers who are alleviating fertilizer costs by including cattle and cover crops into their grain farm rotations. Join us for lunch and exploring options for improved soil health at Canada's Farm Show, June 21st and 22nd in Regina. For more information or to pre-register for free tickets, call 306-421-8538. We'll be right back on RealAg Radio. We're going to hear from Justin Funk of Agri-Studies talking about the latest edition of the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index.
Co-op AgZone Field is a digital agronomy tool designed to help optimize your operation. Through integrated layers of satellite imagery, soil maps, yield data, and more, Co-op Grow Team members use AgZone Field to provide organized, timely, in-season data, allowing you to make informed management decisions quickly and effectively. Trust your Co-op Grow Team to support your operation with AgZone Field. Contact your local co-op today.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on this Wednesday. Let's talk about how you, the audience, is feeling about the current farming environment. Here to talk about the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index results for May is Justin Funk of Agri-Studies. Hey, Justin, how are you?
Hey, I'm well, Shaun. How are you?
I'm doing good. Now we've got the May results out for the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. For our U.S. listeners, this is the Canadian version of the Purdue CME Ag Barometer. What were Canadian farmers, what did they tell us in May about the current, let's start with the financial environment.
Well, for the earlier indexes that we did going back to September, we started to see an increase in current farm financial performance. There was a slight dip in March, but now we get to May and we start seeing that fall below the neutral line. So while it's not dramatic, there is a sentiment there that the current financial position on the farm is in a bit of a decline, and that's also being reflected in the Future Farm Financial Performance Index, which took a rather steep decline here in the latest May survey.
Okay, and I guess how is that the attitudes towards the current and future farm results? Is that negativity showing itself in farmers' willingness to invest in capital and things like that?
Yeah, so that the index that we talk about there is the confidence in making farm investments, so in machinery and infrastructure. And that has been at a low level pretty much through the entirety. We saw an initial decrease from September to November when an interest rate hike was announced, but then it has remained relatively flat since then. So no, that one's not really responding as much to some of these financial indices as we might have expected.
And we also ask about people's outlook for the ag economy going forward, out past 12 months. What was the level of pessimism versus optimism there?
That's where we saw probably the biggest single decline in this index was in the optimism towards the Canadian ag economy. And that's over the 12-month horizon. Looking out on the 5-year horizon, we saw a similar decrease. And what we observed in previous surveys, so this would be going back to March and January, November and September, was measuring the outlook on the grain markets. It was very, very strong in September, and then we saw a big decline in November, and then another decline in January, and so this continuous decline has been happening there, and we hadn't really seen a response in some of the other confidence and optimism indices. Now we are. And so I think that the outlook on the grain markets, I think the reality of that is really starting to settle in and now impact farmer sentiment in other areas.
Yeah, there is a bit of a loop there, right? So I'm feeling quite bearish about the ag commodity markets. That's going to reflect in that how I feel about my future farm financial performance too. Though there's obviously a connection there that everybody can make sense of.
Yeah, and having seen the steady decline in the sentiment towards the commodity markets, maybe there was some hope that there might be a bit of a turnaround or something. I think the reality is just starting to set in now. It's almost like the deflation of the attitude, so to speak, the sentiment.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned the Purdue CME Ag Barometer, where they asked, the first 5 questions that we asked, they also asked. We tailored it to be able to do this. Is there, when you look at the U.S. numbers for May and look at the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index for May, are there differences in terms of how Canadian and U.S. farmers are feeling about the current market?
Yeah, it's interesting just looking at the overall trend lines. The trend lines look very similar, but the actual numbers are different. And so, in looking at the May numbers here, Canadians are definitely more optimistic about the current financial performance on the farm. They're about even on the future financial performance of the farm. But when it comes to the optimism towards the ag economy, we had seen Canadians more generally optimistic there. Now we're seeing them on par. In terms of the future of the ag industry, this is where we have seen sort of a consistent difference where Americans seem to have more of a brighter outlook than Canadians on that particular one. The confidence in making farm investments, definitely a lot lower in the United States than it is in Canada.
Yeah, it's so many similarities, but obviously some differences that's forcing a different level of sentiment on some of those topics. Now, one of the things that we also ask about in the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index is people responding in regards to their mental health compared to a year ago. What did farmers say in the month of May?
So in the month of May, that index was slightly in the negative zone, which would infer that there's generally a slightly lower state of mental health. This is always difficult to measure, but it's interesting to look at that trend line going back to September. In September, during peak production time of year, in this case harvest, it was at 92, which falls below the 100 mark of neutral, so slightly negative. And then in November, it bumped up to 98. And then during the winter months, it was right at the neutral line. And I have to think that there's something to just, maybe taking some time off, a little self-care. And now we get back into peak production time and the number dips down to 94, pretty close to where it was in September. So as always, it'll be interesting to see how that number unfolds when we get a full calendar year, a full production cycle in there to see if there's a trend and if that trend repeats itself year over year.
Yeah, I really hope the market conditions change so we can see some of these index numbers kind of rebound back to some of the prior levels and break that trend that you mentioned in Canada and the U.S., which has very much been on the decline when it comes to current and future farm financial performance. If you are interested in finding out more about the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index, make sure you go to RealAgristudies.com. Or, of course, you can send me an email, shaney@RealAgriculture.com as well. Justin, awesome stuff. Thank you so much, and look forward to our next chat. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Shaun. When
we come back on RealAg Radio, we'll get to the top ag news stories of the day.
Peter Johnson at WheatPete, RealAgriculture.com. I'm the host of The Word, and I love doing The Word. I love the questions. I love the challenges. I love having to apply agronomics to all over the globe and areas outside of my normal jurisdiction. Also, I love the feedback the most, where growers challenge me, tell me about their plot results. Help me to learn. The Word, absolutely the best part of my day.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio. It's now time for the top ag news stories of the day. The Federal Reserve officials agreed to hold interest rates steady after 10 consecutive increases, but signaled they are leaning toward raising them next month if the economy and inflation don't cool more. This is what a lot of the smart money was assuming and guessing. There would be a pause, but the July meeting, I believe it's like the majority believe that there will be an increase at that point. I think this is the decision that a lot of people were really kind of cheering for and hoping for, because assuming, if the data shows a cooling economy in July, then it allows for further pause. So we're in a potential situation here where we could see this kind of what we saw today play out in future months. And this will assist. If you're worried the Fed has gone too far, this is kind of what you wanted to see here today. Wall Street Journal said most analysts penciled in 2 more rate increases this year and lifted their expectations for growth and inflation. The projections released on Wednesday after a 2-day policy meeting. In a statement, the Fed said the decision to maintain the benchmark federal funds rate in a range between 5 and 5.25%, a 16-year high, might be short-lived. In British Columbia, there's this port worker potential strike. More than 7,000 terminal cargo loaders at British Columbia's ports have voted overwhelmingly in support of a strike action against local maritime employers, although both sides are still negotiating to avoid such an outcome, reports the Chronicle Journal. The International Longshore and Warehouse Union Canada says a vote over the weekend yielded 99.24% support for a strike against the BC Maritime Employers Association, if necessary, was the quote that was used. Reuters has a story out about competition for biofuel production. Canadian biofuel producers are threatening to build their next projects in the United States to cash in on rich subsidies for clean fuel and stay competitive, a move that could cost Canada $10 billion Canadian of investment and undermine Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's efforts to build a greener economy. Reducing fuel's carbon intensity is critical to Canada's efforts to curb greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% from the 2005 levels by 2030. Biofuels are alternatives to petroleum-based fuels made from low-carbon sources such as crops and wood waste. Now, why is this happening? Well, it has to do with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. The $430 billion IRA, signed into law by U.S. President Joe Biden last year, aims to cut carbon emissions across the U.S. economy. Biofuel companies are pressing Ottawa to increase supports in the next fiscal update expected late this year. Options include an investment tax credit to offset some capital costs and a contract for differences, a means for de-risking potential changes to carbon pricing and regulatory policies, according to Biofuel Association. So I've heard the same thing in some other processing sectors, that Canada is not exactly, because of the IRA, is not in a competitive advantage situation here. And this is a real problem. And, to give credit to people like the John Stackhouses of the world from RBC, this is what he's been preaching. The IRA is a major threat. Canada needs to respond to remain competitive to be attracting the investment dollars. Otherwise, they're all going to be south of the border. Now, I guess one way you could look at it is, well, let the U.S. taxpayer subsidize and pay for all that. Canada has a free trade agreement with the U.S. and we can ship the raw commodity south. Well, that works until there is border issues. And some people in Canada would say, hey, why can't we have a processing sector? Why do we have to rely so much on the United States to build the processing sector? So, but all this happening at a time where we are seeing the Conservative Party of Canada push push on the clean fuel regulation and calling it a second carbon tax. So we're unpacking this complex box of what the Canadian biofuel industry is going to look like going forward is I'm pretty fascinated about it. The Canadian Grain Commission has announced updates to its official grain grading guide set to take effect with the new cropping year on August 1st. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I encourage you to go to RealAgriculture.com and see the full breakdown. Walmart was out yesterday saying it would invest $257 million US to open a beef packing plant in Kansas in 2025, which would create 600 jobs. The facility will package and distribute cuts to the higher grade Angus beef from Sustainable Beef LLC. Walmart had acquired a minority stake in the ranch-based beef processing plant last year, which is expected to be functional in late 2024. The company's investment plans come at a time when consumers have been trading down to cheaper private labels due to high inflation. So just kind of curious, what do you view as being a bigger problem? Consolidation in a sector. So, for example, Bunge Viterra, there's grain elevation and there's processing in that, but let's just call it a lateral merger. Okay? So, are you more concerned about that, where we're losing competitors in a certain portion of the value chain, or is it more concerning that Walmart is moving down the value chain to also own packing plants? Is one a bigger concern to you as the farmer than the other? So we have like vertical consolidation, and then we have horizontal consolidation. And there's probably somebody that has written a Harvard Business Review paper about this that's using the official language. That's how I would describe it. Horizontal consolidation versus vertical consolidation. Let me know if there's one of those that you feel is a bigger concern. I'm sure Walmart is not stopping here. Anheuser-Busch's InBev Bud Light has lost its crown as the top-selling beer in the U.S. to Constellation Brands' Modelo Especial. So Modelo took the lead with 8.4% of the U.S. retail store beer sales in the 4 weeks ended June 3rd, compared with 7.3% for Bud Light, according to analysis of Nielsen data by consulting firm Bump Williams. Of course, Bud Light has been really facing boycotts from certain sectors of its consumer base based on some of its marketing as of late. So if you told me that Bud Light was at a top spot, I'd believe you. I wouldn't have guessed Modelo being the number one brand. I didn't have that one. I would have thought maybe lots of ways you could go on that. Coors Light, you could, one could also say like a Busch Light, Michelob Ultra. I don't know. What you tend to see when you say, what do you got on tap, or when you say, what do you got in a can, I wouldn't have guessed Modelo. If you have any feedback on today's show, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Or, of course, you can find us across the different social media platforms, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as TikTok. We are Real Agriculture on all of them. Or call that Real Ag feedback line, 855-776-6147. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with Real Ag Radio. And we'll, of course, chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.